Section 1 of The Spirit of Islam, a history of the evolution and ideals of Islam with the life of the Prophet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Spirit of Islam by Syed Ameer Ali. سخن کز بحر دین گویی چه هیبرانی چه سوریانی مکان کز بحر حق جویی چه جبل کا چه جبل سا. What matters it whether the words thou utterest in prayer are Hebrew or Syrian, or whether the place in which thou seekest God is Jabal Ka or Jabal Sa? Sandi. Preface. In the following pages, I have attempted to give the history of the evolution of Islam as a world religion, of its rapid spread, and the remarkable hold it obtained over the conscience and minds of millions of people within a short space of time. The impulse it gave to the intellectual development of the human race is generally recognized, but its great work in the uplifting of humanity is either ignored or not appreciated. Nor are its rationale, its ideals, and its aspirations properly understood. It has been my endeavor in the survey of Islam to elucidate its true place in the history of religions. The review of its rationale and ideals, however feeble, may be of help to wanderers in quest of a constructive faith to steady the human mind after the strain of the recent cataclysm. It is also hoped that to those who follow the faith of Islam, it may be of assistance in the understanding and exposition of the foundations of their convictions. My outline of the life and ministry of the Prophet is based on the Siratul Rasul of Ibn Hisham, who died in 213 AH, 828 or 9 AC. Barely 200 years after the death of the Prophet, supplemented by, among other works, Ibn Ulathir's monumental history, the Chronicles of Tabari, the Insan al-Uyun of al-Halabi, commonly known as Sirat al-Halabiyya. 2 new chapters have been added in this edition, one on the Imamate, the apostolical succession, the other on the idealistic and mystical spirit in Islam. Considerable new matter has also been included in the introduction and Chapter 10, Part 2. I take this opportunity of expressing my gratitude to my esteemed friend, Professor E.G. Brown of Cambridge, one of our foremost Orientalists, for his most valuable criticisms on the last chapter, and to Mr. Muhammad Iqbal, Government of India research scholar at Cambridge, for his careful revision of the proofs and the compilation of the index. I also desire to express my acknowledgments to Mr. Abdul Qayyum Malik for transcribing for the printers the Arabic quotations for the new chapters and verifying the Quranic references, and to the publishers for their unvarying courtesy and patience over a difficult publication. The work has been carried through the press under heavy pressure of public duties, and I claim on that ground the indulgence of my readers for any mistake that may have passed uncorrected. N.B. A few words are necessary to explain the system of transliteration adopted in this work. I have tried to adhere with small modification to the system I have pursued in my previous publications. The letter th, pronounced by the Arab with a lisp like th in thin, to a non-Arab conveys a sound almost identical with s in sin, and he accordingly pronounces it as such. Nor, unless an Arabic scholar, does he perceive any difference between th and sin or sod. He pronounces them all alike. Similarly, dhal, zay, dod, pronounced by the Arab something like tad, and da convey to the non-Arab almost identical sounds. Certainly he cannot help pronouncing them identically. He also perceives no difference between ta, soft t, and ta, or between the hard aspirate ha in Ahmed, Muhammad, Mahmud, etc., and the softer used in Harun. I have therefore not attempted to differentiate these letters by dots or commas, which, however useful for purposes of translation into Arabic, Persian, Turkish, or Urdu, is only bewildering to the general reader unacquainted with the Arabic alphabet and pronunciation. I have given the words as commonly pronounced by non-Arabs. In the case of words spelt with a th in common use in India and Persia, such as hadith, masnavi, isna ashariya, etc., I have not considered it necessary to denote the Arabic pronunciation with a th. The ordinary fatha I have represented by a, pronounced as u in kat or but, excepting in such words as are now commonly written in English with an e, as Seljuk, pronounced Saljuk, Marwan, pronounced Marwan, etc. The ordinary zamma by u, pronounced like you in Pul or in Buldan. The ordinary kasra with the letter I, as in Misr. Alif with the fatha is represented by a, as in had. Alif with the zamma by u, as in Abdul Muttalib, with a kasra by I, as in Ibn Abil Jawari. Waw with a zamma by o, and sometimes by o circumflex, although like Kufa and several other words, the last syllables in Mahmud, Harun, and Ma'mun are spelled with a waw. To have represented them by an o or o circumflex would have conveyed a wholly wrong notion of the pronunciation, which is like u. I have therefore used u to represent waw in such words. Waw with a fatha I have represented by a u, as in Maudud. Ya with a kasra, when used in the middle of a word, I have represented by I, as in Arish, but in Amir I have kept the classical and time-honored double E. Ya with a fatha, similarly situated by AI, as in Zaid. Ya with a fatha at the beginning of a word is represented by YE, as in Yazid, with a zamma by YU, as in Yusuf. Excepting such names as are commonly known to be spelled with an ayn, as in Abd, in Abdul Malik, Abdul Rahman, Arab, Abbas, Aziz, Iraq, etc., I have used the inverted comma to denote that letter. With regard to names which have become familiar in certain garbs, I have made no alteration, such as Kaaba, Amar, Abdullah, Basra, spelled with a sod, etc. Ghain is represented by GH, but I have not attempted to differentiate between Kaf and Qaf, and made no alteration in the time-honored spelling of the Quran. The common G, the Persian Gaf, and P have no place in the Arabic alphabet, and therefore the Persian G and P are transformed in Arabic into J and K and B or PH, F, as in Atabek and Isfahan. Kha is represented by KH. The L of L, when occurring before certain letters, technically called Shamsiyya, is assimilated with them in sound, as Ash-Shams, Ad-Din, Ar-Rida, As-Salat, etc. I have used the word Muslim, M-O-S-L-E-M, in preference to Muslim, M-U-S-L-I-M, as most Europeans unacquainted with Arabic pronounce the U in Muslim as in public. End of section 1. Section 2 of The Spirit of Islam by Syed Ameer Ali. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction. Hey که در هیچ جا نداری جا، والعجب مانده‌ام که در هر جایی، کافر و دین هر دو در رهت پویان، وحده لا شریک له گویان. O thou who hast no place in any place, wonder-struck am I that thou art at every place. Faith and no faith are both engaged in thy search, both crying aloud, He is the one, He is the all alone. The continuity of religious progress among mankind is a subject of enthralling interest to the student of humanity. The gradual awakening of the human mind to the recognition of a personality, of a supreme will overshadowing the universe, the travails through which individuals and races have passed before they arrived at the conception of an universal soul pervading, regulating, and guiding all existence, furnish lessons of the deepest import. The process by which humanity has been lifted from the adoration of material objects to the worship of God has often been retarded. Masses of mankind and individuals have broken away from the stream of progress, have listened to the promptings of their own desires, have given way to the cravings of their own hearts. They have gone back to the worship of their passions, symbolized in the idols of their infancy. But though unheard, the voice of God has always sounded the call to truth, and when the time has arrived, His servants have risen to proclaim the duties of man to himself and to his Creator. These men have been the veritable, quote, messengers of heaven, end quote. They came among their people as the children of their time. They represented the burning aspirations of the human soul for truth, purity, and justice. Each was an embodiment of the spiritual necessities of his age. Each came to purify, to reform, to elevate a degraded race, a corrupted commonwealth. Some came as teachers of a smaller culture to influence a smaller sphere. Others came with a worldwide message, a message not confined to one race or nation, but intended for all humanity. Such was Muhammad. His mission was not to the Arabs alone. He was not sent for one age or clime, but, quote, for all mankind to the end of the world, end quote. The advent of this great teacher, whose life from the moment of his ministry is a verifiable record, was not a mere accident, an unconnected episode in the history of the world. The same causes, the same crying evils, the same earnest demand for a quote-unquote assured trust in an all-pervading power, which led to the appearance on the shores of Galilee in the reign of Augustus Caesar of a prophet whose life is a tragedy, operated with greater force in the 7th century of the Christian era. The beginning of the 7th century, as has been rightly said, was an epoch of disintegration, national, social, and religious. Its phenomena were such as have always involved a fresh form of positive faith to recall all wandering forces to the inevitable track of spiritual evolution, quote, towards the integration of personal worship, end quote. They all pointed to the necessity of a more organic revelation of divine government than that attained by Judaism or Christianity. The holy flames kindled by Zoroaster, Moses, and Jesus had been quenched in the blood of man. A corrupt Zoroastrianism, battling for centuries with a still more corrupt Christianity, had stifled the voice of humanity and converted some of the happiest portions of the globe into a veritable Akeldama. Incessant war for supremacy, perpetual internecine strife, combined with the ceaseless wrangling of creeds and sects, had sucked the lifeblood out of the hearts of nations, and the people of the earth, trodden under the iron heels of a lifeless sacerdotalism, were crying to God from the misdeeds of their masters. Never in the history of the world was the need so great, the time so ripe, for the appearance of a deliverer. In order, therefore, to appreciate thoroughly the achievement of Muhammad in the moral world, it is necessary to take a rapid survey of the religious and social condition of the nations of the earth previous to and about the time of the Islamic dispensation. The high tableland of Bactria, appropriately styled by Arab geographers ul-Bilad, or Mother of Countries, is supposed to be the cradle of humanity, the original birthplace of creeds and nations. Through the faint and shadowy light which comparative ethnology throws on the infancy of mankind, we perceive groups of families congregated in this primeval home of the human race, gradually coalescing into clans and tribes, and then forced by the pressure of increasing population, issuing in successive waves to people the face of the globe. The Hamitic branch were apparently the first to leave their ancient habitations. They were followed by the Turanians, or, as they are sometimes called, the Ugro-Finnish tribes, supposed to be an offshoot of the Japhetic family. Some of them apparently proceeded northwards, and then spreading themselves in the east, founded the present Mongolian branch of the human race. Another section proceeded westward and settled in Azerbaijan, Hamadan, and Yilan, countries to the south and southwest of the Caspian, better known in ancient history as Media. A portion of these, descending afterwards into the fertile plains of Babylonia, enslaved the earlier Hamitic colonies, and in course of time, amalgamating with them, formed the Akkadian nation, the Cushites of the Jewish and Christian scriptures. This composite race created Babylon and gave birth to a form of religion which, in its higher phases, was akin to natural pantheism. In its lower phases, with its pan-demonism, its worship of the sun gods and moon gods, closely associated with the phallic cult and the sexual instinct, the sacrifice of children to Baal and Moloch, of virginity to Beltis and Ashtoreth, it marks an epoch when high material civilization was allied to gross licentiousness, and cruelty was sanctioned by religion. The Semites were the next to leave the primeval home. They also, following in the footsteps of the Turanians, migrated towards the west, and apparently settled themselves in the northern part of the Mesopotamian delta. Increasing in numbers and strength, they soon overthrew the Babylonian kingdom and founded a far-reaching empire which wielded its sway over all of the neighboring states. In their seat of power between the two great rivers of Western Asia, the Assyrians at times rose to a positive monotheistic conception. Their system of celestial hierarchy furnishes indications of a distinct recognition of one supreme personality. Whilst the main body of the Semitic colony was developing itself in the upper parts of the delta, a small section had penetrated far into a district called Ur, within the boundaries of the Chaldean monarchy. The patriarch of this tribe, whose self-imposed exile and wanderings have passed into the religious legends of more than one creed, became the father of the future makers of history. Footnote: in the Arabian traditions, the father of Abraham is called Azar, which is evidently the same name as Ashur, and the beautiful idols of Azar are frequently referred to in Muslim literature. These traditions confirm the belief that Abraham was of Assyrian origin. End of footnote. The Japhetic family seems to have tarried longest in its ancient habitation. whilst the other races which had broken away from the original stock were forming empires and evolving creeds, the Japhetic branch underwent a development peculiar to itself. But the march of nations once set on foot was never to cease, actuated by that spirit of unrest which works in barbarous tribes, or influenced by the pressure of population and the scarcity of space in their old haunts for the pursuit of their pastoral avocations, tribe after tribe moved away towards the west. Among the first were the Pelasgians and the Celts. Other tribes followed, until the Aryans proper were left alone in their old haunts. One section apparently had its abode near Badakhshan, the other towards Balkh proper, where for centuries they lived almost isolated from the neighboring nations, unaffected by their wars or their movements. The light of history which has dawned on the Western races, the founders of kingdoms and civilizations, also falls upon these ancient dwellers of the earth, and reveals, though indistinctly and as though through a mist, several clans gathered together on that plateau. Just emerged from the savageness into barbarism, they are becoming alive to the sense of an universal ideality. Innumerable idealities are taking the place of the natural objects hitherto worshipped with fear and trembling. With some of them, the host of abstractions and personifications of the powers of nature are subordinated to two comprehensive principles, light and darkness. The sun, the bright harbinger of life and light, becomes the symbol of a beneficent divinity, whose power, though held in check, is eventually to conquer the opposing principle of evil and darkness. With others, the idealities which they now impress on the fetish they worshipped before merge in each other, at one time standing forth as distinct personal entities, at another time resolving themselves into a hylozoic whole. Gradually the clouds lift, and we see the tribal and clan formations giving way to monarchical institutions, agriculture taking by slow degrees the place of pastoral avocations, primitive arts being cultivated, the use of metals gaining ground, and, above all, the higher conception of a supreme personality forcing itself upon the yet unopened mind. Kayumurs, Hoshang, and the other old kings of whom Firdusi sings with such wondrous power are types of an advancing civilization. The introduction of the monarchical institutions among the Aryans proper seems to be coeval with that religious conflict between the two branches of the Aryan family which led to the expulsion of the eastern branch from their Bactrian home. A powerful religious revolution had been inaugurated among the Western Aryans by a teacher whose name has been preserved in the literature of his religion as Sitama Zarathustra. The sharp religious conflict which resulted from this movement has left its mark in the deep imprecations heaped by the Vedic hymn-singers on the enemy of their race and creed, the Dhyaradashti of the Vedas. The attitude of the Vedic hymn-singers towards the Reformed faith, even more than the extraordinary coincidence in names, furnishes the strongest proof that the religious divergence was the immediate cause of the split between the two branches of the Aryans proper. In this, probably the first religious war waged among mankind, the Western dualistic clans were successful in driving their half-polytheistic, half-pantheistic brethren across the Paropamisadae. The Eastern Aryans burst into India, driving before them the earlier black races, massacring and enslaving them, treating them always as inferior beings, dasyus and sudras, slaves and serfs. The difference between the Vedic and the Zoroastrian religions was, however, purely relative. Zoroastrianism substituted for the worship of the phenomena the adoration of the cause. It converted the gods of the Vedas into demons and the Deva worshippers into infidels, whilst the Vedic hymn singer on his side called the Ahura of the Avesta an evil god, and Asura a power hostile to the gods, and heaped burning maledictions on the head of Dhyaratashti. Whilst the place and time of the early Zoroaster's birth are enwrapped in mystery, under Darius Hustapes arose another teacher, who under the same name revived, organized, and enlarged the basis of the ancient teachings. Retracing our steps for a moment, we see the tide of Aryan conquest in India flowing eastward and southward for centuries. The old Aryan religion which the invaders had brought from their ancient homes consisted chiefly in the worship of the Manes and the adoration of the powers of nature symbolized in visible phenomena. In the land of the five rivers, the spiritual conception developed further. We can read in the Vedas the march of progress until we arrive at the zenith of Hindu religious ideas in the Upanishads, which often in the intensity of spiritual yearning approach the highest monotheism. The Upanishads dwell not only on the immanence of God, a conception which gave birth in later times to the material pantheism of India, but also teach that the Supreme Spirit is the protector of all beings and sovereign over all creation, that he dwells in the hearts of men, and finally absorbs the individual soul in infinity, quote, as the ocean absorbs the river, end quote. When that absorption takes place, the human soul loses all consciousness of its experience in the earthly frame. But these interesting records of human progress contained within themselves unquestioned germs of spiritual decadence, which soon reversed the process of evolution. And thus, instead of observing a further uplifting, we see a progressive declension. The Upanishads make way for the Puranic cults, which again succumb to the power of the Tantric worship. The idea to which the Upanishads frequently give expression, that the Supreme Spirit manifests himself in various forms, gave rise to the conception of the avatars or incarnations. Just as in the Western pagan world, philosophy failed to satisfy the craving of the popular mind for a personal God who had dwelt among mankind and held familiar discourse with them, the theistic aspirations of the Upanishads did not appeal to the heart or touch the emotions of the masses of India. And a hero god was soon found in a member of the warrior caste, who came before long to be identified with the Supreme Spirit and to be regarded in his earthly existence as an incarnate god. The development of the Krishna cult, like that of its rival, the worship of the quote-unquote dread mother, illustrates forcibly not merely the religious welter which prevailed in India in the 7th century of the Christian era, but also the gulf which divided the minds of the philosophers who composed the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of Faith, from the thoughts and feelings of the populace. Footnote: a recent writer remarks that the Bhagavad Gita no doubt shows traces of theism, but this theism is blended with other and non-theistic elements. End of footnote. It is abundantly clear that long before they burst into Hindustan proper, the Aryan settlers in the Punjab, or their priests and religious teachers, made the most stringent rules to prevent the intermixture of the invaders and their descendants with the races they had conquered and enslaved in their steady and prolonged march towards the east. The touch of the latter, who were turned into the lower and servile caste, was pollution. All the religious rites peculiar to the three higher castes were strictly forbidden to them. Among all the flow and ebb of Aryan Hindu thought in the region of pantheism, The worship of the Manes had always clung to the Hindu mind as an essential part of his religious-social system. The Sudra was permitted to offer oblations to his dead ancestors, but no Brahman could officiate at the rites without incurring the heaviest penalties. If a Sudra overheard a Brahman reciting the Vedas, he was to be punished by having molten lead poured into his ears. If he happened to sit on the same bench with the Brahman, he was liable to be branded, whilst unions, legitimate or illegitimate, between the quote-unquote twice-born, as the three superior castes were called, and the Sudras were interdicted under the cruelest penalties. No legislation, however, could prevent their religious ideas and practices being influenced by the primitive beliefs. In the course of time, the divinities of the pre-Aryan tribes and races were incorporated into the Hindu pantheon, and their worship became part of the Hindu daily ritual. The amalgamations of diverse beliefs of unequal growth and varying tendencies had their inevitable result in the debasement of the complex and abstruse pantheism the philosophers were endeavoring through ages to evolve. Before the followers of Islam lifted the veil behind which India had lived enshrouded in mystery for thousands of years, she possessed no history. It is impossible to say when Vasudeva Krishna lived or to judge of his personality. There are innumerable legends which verge on the absurd and puerile, legends evidently manufactured by the priests who had become the equals, if not the superiors, of the gods, and whose interest it was to keep the minds of the vulgar fascinated and enthralled. The place which Vasudeva Krishna occupies in the Hindu pantheon is that of the incarnation of Vishnu, and as such he forms the central figure of the devotional part of the Bhagavad Gita. He is evidently a composite divinity, one of the man-gods associated with him being the gay hero who lived among the cowherds of Gokul and disported himself in the famous groves of Vrindavan with his merry companions. Footnote: Krishna is usually called the Gopala Krishna or cowherd Krishna. His female companions are called the Gopis, the milkmaids. Many a pretty legend is woven round the adventures of this hero god of the Ahirs, the cowherd caste of Upper India. Krishna had been somewhat inaptly called the Apollo of the Hindus, though it is difficult to clothe him with the poetry which generally envelops the Greek god. End of footnote. The cult of Vasudeva Krishna inculcated absolute dharma, or faith, as the key to salvation. The believer in this incarnate Vishnu, whatever his conduct in life, was assured of eternal happiness. The doctrine of perfect faith gave birth to practices and beliefs which are still current in India. As righteousness consists in the concentration of the mind in one's self as identical with the Supreme Spirit represented in Krishna, the gymnosophic ascetic practices acquired in the eyes of the people a superlative merit. To sit for years in the forest with the eyes fixed on one spot of the human body and the mind on Krishna, to stand for years on one leg, to be swung round by hooks fixed in the flesh, were acts of devotion which cured all sins. To expiate a sin or to fulfill a vow, a man might be employed to measure by the length of his body the distance from the abode of the penitent to the temple of the deity. To read the Bhagavad Gita with true faith, or to bathe in the Ganges or any holy pool, absolved every man or woman from all breaches of the moral laws. It is difficult to tell when Saktism acquired the predominant hold it now possesses on large masses of the Hindu population. The Sakti is the female half and active creative side of each Hindu deity. The Sakti, or spouse of Shiva, is the dread goddess known under various names, such as Parbati, Bhavani, Kali, Mahakali, Durga, Chamunda. The worship of this goddess, as described in the drama of Bhavabhuti, written apparently in the 7th century of the Christian era, was celebrated with human sacrifices and other revolting rites. There is nothing of the, quote, Mater Dolorosa, end quote, in the spouse of Shiva, by whatever name she is invoked or in whatever form she is worshipped. She possesses none of the attributes of human pity or sympathy with human suffering the Alexandrian worshipper associated with Isis, quote, the goddess of myriad names, end quote. This awe-inspiring, not to say awful concept of a decadent religious mind, evidently borrowed from the pre-Aryan races, who delights in human blood and revels in human misery, has few parallels in the paganism of the world. For even Cybele, the Magna Mater of the Romans, was not so merciless or took so much pleasure in inflicting pain as the Sakti of the quote-unquote god of destruction, Shiva. This deity is worshipped according to the ritual of the Tantras, which may be regarded as the Bible of Saktism. Many of the Tantric hymns are imbued with considerable devotional spirit, and the invocations addressed to the goddess often appeal to her pity. But whatever mystical meaning the Tantras may possess for the philosopher, the people commonly accept the worship in its most literal sense. Footnote: there are two chief divisions of Tantric worshippers, the Dakshinachari and Vamachari, or right and left-hand ritualists. The worship of the former is public and not otherwise noticeable than as addressed to other goddesses such as Lakshmi or Mahalakshini, the Sakti of Vishnu. In the left-hand worship, specially called Tantrika, the exclusive object of adoration is Kali. This worship is private and is said to be celebrated with impure practices. This particular cult has an enormous number of followers all over India and branches into various subdivisions. In the season of the Durga Puja, which is usually celebrated in the month of August, the image of Durga is carried about seated on a throne. In Upper India she is painted as yellow of complexion. In Bengal she is represented as absolutely black, with 4 hands, seated on a tiger. In the temple of Kalighat, from which Calcutta derives its name, dripping skulls might be seen hanging from her neck. In one of the temples at Jaipuri, the goddess may be seen with her head twisted round. The tradition is that the lady turned her face in disgust when a goat was offered to her in sacrifice instead of a human being. End of footnote. From the 2 great epics, one of which tells the story of the war between the Pandus and the Kurus, and the other the legend of the abduction of Sita by the king of Ceylon, we can form a fairly accurate idea of the popular creeds of the time. Both represent a developed society and considerable material progress combined with great moral decadence. Thus, long before the appearance of Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, religious worship among the masses of India had sunk into mere mechanical performance of sacrifices and oblations, at which the ability of the ministering priest, without whose services their observance was not permissible, to perform the quote-unquote God-compelling rites with the appropriate incantations, rather than the conduct or piety of the worshipper, supplied the test of merit. The revolt of Gautama and of Mahavira, Mahabir, represented the natural uprise of the Hindu mind against a selfish sacerdotalism. Both deny a creative principle and the existence of a supreme intelligence governing and regulating the universe. Both affirm the eventual annihilation of individual life. Both dwell on the merit of work in bringing about this blissful consummation. But whilst Jainism has hung onto the skirts of Brahmanism and is now practically a Brahmanical sect, Buddhism struck out boldly a new path for itself. It placed karma in the forefront of its scheme of salvation, and its great teacher tried to fulfill its claims in his own life. Its conception of the destiny of man after death was quite opposed to Brahmanical doctrines, and its occult mysticism soon passed into other creeds. But in the land of its birth, after a short but glorious existence, Buddhism met with a cruel fate, and the measure of punishment that was meted out to it by a triumphant Brahmanism is depicted on the temples of southern India. It must be admitted, however, that in its pristine garb, Buddhism did not possess the attractions Hinduism offered to its votaries. It never claimed to be a positive religion, and its quote-unquote rewards and sanctions, its promise of bliss in a future existence, its penalties for failure to perform duties in this life, were too shadowy to stir the heart of the masses. It had soon to abandon its contest with the outside world, or to arrive at a compromise with the religion it had tried to supplant. And it was not long before the religion that Buddha preached had to allow its lay votaries to substitute prayer wheels for pious work, or to take to tantrism to supplement its own barren efforts. Its failure under the most favorable circumstances in the land of its nativity sealed its fate as a rousing religious system, although in some of its mystical aspects it exercised considerable influence on the philosophies of Western Asia and Egypt. On the expulsion of Buddhism from India, Brahmanism regained its supremacy. The long shadow under which it had lived whilst the religion of Buddha dominated the country had brought no improvement to its spiritual conceptions, and the lifeless formalism against which Buddha had revolted was now re-established on a stronger foundation. The lives of men and women were under the restored Brahmanical regime regulated more closely than ever by a sacrificial cult which appealed to their senses, perhaps to their emotions, rather than to their spiritual instincts. Among the masses, religious worship became a daily round of meaningless ritual. For them, quote, the chief objects of worship were the priests, the monies, and, for form's sake, the Vedic gods. End quote. Fetishism, as a part of the aboriginal belief, was never eradicated from the Indian continent by philosophical Hinduism or by practical Buddhism. It now entered into the inner life of all castes. Trees, stones, and other natural objects, along with the idols in which the family gods, the household penates, and the ancient divinities were symbolized, shared the adoration of the populace. The great code of Manu, of which Hinduism is justly proud, and which became in later centuries the model for the legal doctrines of other Eastern races, represents a legislation for a state of society where a great advance in material civilization was combined with the absolute domination of the priestly caste and an astonishing moral decadence among the masses. Like the priest, the king was now a divinity. In the 2nd century of the Christian era, whilst Manu's code was still held in reverence and treated as the final authority, its place was taken by the commentary of Yajnavalkya, the contemplative master. To him caste was as iron-bound as to Manu, and the Sudra as impure as in early times. Female infanticide, as among the pagan Arabs, was common. There is no record when widow burning was first introduced, but it must have been common in the 7th century of the Christian era. To the widow, death, however terrible, must have been a welcome release, for unless she was the mother of children, her lot was one of dire misery. A woman was debarred from studying the Vedas or participating in the oblations to the manis or in the sacrifices to the deities. The wife's religion was to serve her lord. Her eternal happiness depended on the strict performance of that duty. And the faithful wife, who sacrificed herself on the funeral pyre of her dead spouse, found a niche in the hearts of all the votaries of Hinduism as one of the best and noblest of her sex, and often became herself the object of worship. Whilst thinking minds saw in the puerile practices of the religion a deeper meaning, whilst their souls floated far above the ceremonialism of the creed they professed, not one philosopher or priest viewed with horror the cruel immolations of the hapless widow, usually no more than a child. Religious associations, generally composed of both sexes and not always remarkable for austerity of life, had already sprung up, and numerous celibate brotherhoods worshipping different divinities had come into existence. They invariably congregated in monasteries into which women were admitted as lay members. Among them, as among the mendicant fraternities that were established about the same time, the professed celibacy was more nominal than real, honored in its breach rather than in its observance. Large numbers of the mendicant brotherhoods lived in comfort and ease in temples and mutts. Others, like the begging friars of the Middle Ages and the vulgar cynics of the Flavian period, wandered in search of merit from the doors of the devout. Their sole recommendation to the charity of the pious consisted in their matted locks, their unkempt beard, the ochre-coloured shirt that hung over their shoulders, the ash-covered naked bodies, and the inevitable beggar's gourd and staff. As the divinities loved music and dancing, a large number of dancing girls were attached to the temples who were by no means vestal, and whose services were at the disposal of the ministrants of the cult. Women occupied a very inferior position in early Hindu legislation, and Manu's extreme denunciation of the sex can be compared only to the fanatical pronouncement of the Christian saint Tertullian. Women, says Manu, have impure appetites. They show weak flexibility and bad conduct. Day and night they must be kept in subjection." As regards the Sudras, he declared, almost in the words of the Pandects, that the Creator has made them slaves, and that a man belonging to that caste, even when he is emancipated by his master, cannot be free, for bondage being natural to him, who can deliver him from it? Such, in brief, was the religious and social condition among the people of one of the most gifted sections of the Aryan race at the time when the Prophet of Islam brought his message to the world. End of section 2. Section 3 of The Spirit of Islam by Syed Ameer Ali. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction continued. Let us now turn to Persia, a country which, by its proximity to the birthplace of Islam and the powerful influence it has always exercised on Mohammedan thought, not to speak of the character and tone it communicated to Judaism and Christianity, deserves our earnest attention. Consolidated into a nation, and with a new spiritual development, the Western Aryans soon burst their ancient bounds and spread themselves over the regions of modern Persia and Afghanistan. They appear to have conquered or destroyed most of the Hamitic and Kushite races inhabiting those tracts, and gradually reached the confines of the Caspian, where they found the more tenacious and hardy Turanians settled in Media and Susiana. Before, however, they had succeeded in subjugating the Turanians, they themselves fell under the yoke of a foreign invader, Kushite or Assyrian, more probably the latter, under whose iron sway they remained for a considerable time. Footnote: according to the Persian tradition, Zahak ruled over Iran for over 1,000 years, and this is supposed by several scholars to represent the exact period of Assyrian domination. The rise of the Faridun would, according to this view, be synchronous with the downfall of Nineveh. End footnote. With the expulsion of the foreigners commenced that conflict between Iran and Turan, which lasted with varying fortunes for centuries and ended with the partial subjugation of the Turanians in Media and Susiana. The frequent contact of the followers of Afrasiab and Kaikawus in the field and the whole exercised a lasting effect on the Persic faith. The extreme materialism of the Turanians did not fail to degrade the yet undeveloped idealism of their Iranian rivals and neighbors, who, whilst they succeeded in superimposing themselves on the ancient settlers of Media, had partially to incorporate Turanian worship with their own, and thus, whilst in Persia Ormuzd alone was adored and Ahriman held up to execration, in Media the good and the evil principle were both adored at the altars. Naturally, the Turanian population was more inclined to worship their ancient national god than the deity of their Aryan conquerors, and in the popular worship Ahriman or Afrasiab took precedence of Ormuzd. The Assyrian Empire had fallen before a coalition, the first of its kind known in history, of the Medes and the Babylonians, but the religion of Ashur, from its long domination over many of the parts occupied by the Aryans, left an ineffaceable mark on the conceptions of the Zoroastrians. The complex system of celestial coordination and the idea prevalent among the Assyrians of a divine hierarchy engrafted itself on Zoroastrianism. Ormuzd was henceforth worshipped as a second Ashur, and the Persian symbol of the god of light, the all-beneficent power, became a winged warrior with bow and lifted hand enclosed in the world's circle. Their symbol of growth also, the tree with the candelabra branches ending upwards in the pine cone, was converted into the Persian fir cone. Before the rise of Cyrus in Farsistan and his consolidating conquests, the symbolic worship in vogue among the early emigrants and settlers became degraded among the masses into pyrolatry, or took the form of Chaldeo-Assyrian Sabaism. The city of Ashur, which had ruled Western Asia up to the confines of India for nearly 1,000 years, and almost wrested from the pharaohs the empire of Egypt, the city of the mighty Sargon and the great Sennacherib, had fallen before the combined forces of the Babylonian and the Mede, never again to raise its head among the nations of the world. Babylon, which after its early rivalry with Nineveh had been reduced to a dependency of Assyria, became again the center of Asiatic civilization. She gathered up the arts and sciences of 1,000 years of growth, and the product of, quote, interfused races and religions, temples and priesthoods, end quote, and supplied the connecting link between the inorganic faith of antiquity and the modern beliefs. Assyria had, with the civilization and literature of the early Akkadians, also borrowed much of their religion. Babylon, rising into more potent grandeur from the ashes of Nineveh, centered in herself the essence of the Assyrian and Chaldean cults. Under Nebuchadnezzar, the empire of Babylonia attained the zenith of its power. Judea fell, and the flower of the nation was carried into captivity to lament by the waters of Babylon the downfall of the kingdom of Jehovah. The mighty conqueror penetrated into Arabia and overwhelmed and nearly destroyed the Ishmaelites. He smote the Tyrians and broke the power of the Egyptian pharaoh. In spite of the maledictions heaped upon her head by the Hebrew patriot, Babylon was by no means such a hard taskmaster as Egypt. The Israelites themselves bear testimony to the generosity of their treatment. Not until the Redeemer was nigh with his mighty hosts, marching to the conquest of the doomed city, did the children of Israel raise their voice against Babylon. Then burst forth the storm of imprecations, of predictions of woe, which displayed the characteristics of the race in its pristine savagery. Quote, "By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. O daughter of Babylon, happy shall be he who dashes thy little ones against the stones." End quote. Psalm 137. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon was undisputably the center of all existing civilizations, and the influence wielded by her priesthood did not cease with the empire of Babylonia. The mark of the Babylonian conceptions is traced in unmistakable characters in both the Judaical and Christian systems. The long exile of the Jews among the Chaldean priesthood, the influence which some of the Hebrews obtained in the court of the Babylonian king, and the unavoidable interfusion of the two peoples tended to impart a new character to later Judaism. They were carried to Babylon in a state of semi-barbarism. They returned to Zion after their long probation in the land of exile, a new people, advanced in faith and doctrine, with larger aspirations and their political vision extended. With the conquest of Babylon begins a new era in religious development. Henceforth, the religion of dualism holds the empire of Asia. The grand toleration which Cyrus extended towards the Jews naturally led to his exaltation as, quote-unquote, the Messiah, the Redeemer, quote, the anointed Savior of the world, end quote. The captivity of the Hebraic tribes and their enforced settlement near the seat of Persian domination, and their subsequent intermixture under Cyrus with the Persians, most probably gave impetus to that religious reform among the Zoroastrians which occurred during the reign of Darius Hystaspes. There was mutual action and reaction. The Israelites impressed on renovated Zoroastrianism a deep and abiding conception of a divine personality overshadowing the universe. They received from the Iranians the notion of a celestial hierarchy and the idea of duality of principles in the creation of good and evil. Henceforth, it is not the Lord who puts a lying spirit into the mouth of evildoers. Satan, like Ahriman, from this time takes a prominent part in the religious and moral history of the Hebrews. The reign of Cyrus was one of conquest, hardly of organization. The reign of Darius was one of consolidation. Stern worshipper of Ormuzd, to whom he ascribes all his victories, he endeavored to purify the faith of Zoroaster of all its foreign excrescencies, to stamp out the magism of the Medes from its stronghold, and to leave Aryan Persia the dominant power of the civilized world. Nothing, however, could arrest the process of decay. Before 100 years had gone by, Zoroastrianism had imbibed to the full the evils which it had fought against in its infancy. The scourgers of idolatry, the uncompromising iconoclasts, who in their fiery zeal had slaughtered the Egyptian Apis and overturned its shrine, soon absorbed into the worship of Ormuzd the Semitic gods of their subject states. The old Magian element worship was revived, and Artaxerxes Mnemnon, one of the immediate successors of Darius, introduced among the Zoroastrians the worship of that androgynous Mithra, the Persian counterpart of the Chaldean Mylitta or Anitis, with its concomitant phallic cult. The development of this Mithra cult into the gorgeous worship of the beautiful sun god is one of the marvels of history. The resplendent sun ascending over the cleft mountains, chasing the bull into its lair and with its blood atoning human sins, is a conception which has left its ineffaceable mark on one of the dominant religions of the world. This worship of Mithra was carried by the Roman legionaries from the valley of the Euphrates to the furthest corners of Europe, and in the reign of Diocletian it became the state religion of Rome. Never was the condition of woman so bad, never was she held under greater subjection, a slave to the caprice of man, than under the Mago-Zoroastrians. The laws of Manu imposed certain rules of chastity, and the stringency of primitive exogamy exercised a restraining effect upon human passions. The Persian, in the relations of the sexes, recognized no law but that of his own will. He could marry his nearest kindred and divorce his wives at his pleasure. The system of female seclusion was not confined to the Persians alone. Among the Ionic Greek, women were confined within the gynaikonitis, often kept under lock and key, and never allowed to appear in public. But the Greek gynaikonomoi were not, until later times, mutilated specimens of humanity. In Persia, the custom of employing eunuchs to guard the women prevailed from the remotest antiquity. As in Greece, concubinage was a recognized social institution, and was interwoven with the foundations of society. The Persian, however, never allowed lewdness to be incorporated with the national worship. He worshipped no Aphrodite Pandemos, nor was Zoroastrian society tainted with that quote-unquote moral pestilence, the most degrading of all vices, which was universal in Greece, which spread itself afterwards in Rome, and was not even rooted out by Christianity. With the downfall of the Achaemenian Empire ended the vitality of Zoroastrianism as a motive power in the growth of the world. The swarms of conquerors who swept like whirlwinds over the face of Persia destroyed all social and moral life. The Macedonian conquest, with the motley hordes which followed on its footsteps, the influx of all the dregs of Lesser Asia, Cilicians, Tyrians, Pamphylians, Phrygians, and various others, half Greeks, half Asians, obeying no moral law, the hasty and reckless temper of the conqueror himself, all led to the debasement of the Zoroastrian faith. The Mobeds, the representatives of the national life, were placed under the ban of persecution by the foreigner, the aim of whose life was to Hellenize Asia. Alexander's career was splendidly meteoric. Shorn of the legends which have surrounded his life and turned it into an epopee, he stands before us a man of gigantic conceptions and masterly purposes, possessed of a towering ambition, a genius which overpowered all opposition, and a personality which enabled him to mold the minds of all around him according to his own will. He was a nature full of contradictions, a disciple of Aristotle, who aimed at the Hellenization of Asia, with himself as the central figure in the adoration of the world. An associate of philosophers and wise men, his life was disgraced by excesses of a revolting type. Quote, "The sack of Tyre and the enslavement of its population, the massacres and executions in India and Bactria, the homicide of Clitus, the death warrants of Philotas and the faithful Parmenio, the burning of Persepolis, and the conflagration of its splendid library at the instigation of a courtesan, are acts," says an apologist and an admirer, "for which no historian has found a palliation." With the conquest of Alexander and the extinction of the Achaemenian dynasty, Zoroastrianism gave way to Hellenism and the worst traditions of Chaldean civilization. The extreme partiality of the hero of many legends towards Babylon and his anxious desire to resuscitate that city and make it the center of a mightier and more complete civilization led him to discourage all creeds and faiths, all organizations, religious or political, which militated with his one great desire. Under the Seleucidae, the process of denationalization went on apace. Antiochus Epiphanes, the cruel persecutor of the worshippers of Jehovah, won for himself from them as well as the Zoroastrians the unenviable designation of Ahriman. Even the rise of the Parthian power tended to accelerate the decline and ruin of Zoroastrianism. The Seleucidae ruled on the Tigris and the Orontes. The Parthians formed for themselves a kingdom in the middle portion of the Achaemenian Empire. The Greco-Bactrian dynasties were in possession of the eastern tracts, viz. Bactria and the northern part of Afghanistan. The state religion of the Seleucidae was a mixture of Chaldeo-Hellenism. The Jews and Zoroastrians were placed under the ban and ostracized. Under the Parthians, Mazdism, though not actually extinguished, was compelled to hide itself from the gaze of the rulers. In quiet and settled parts, Zoroastrianism became mixed with the old Sabaism of the Medes and the Chaldeans. Or, were kept alive in its pristine character, it was confined to the hearts of some of the priests who had taken refuge in the inaccessible recesses of their country. But with Parthia enlarged into an empire, and the Parthian sovereigns aspiring to the title of Shahanshah, persecution gave way to toleration, and Mago-Zoroastrianism again raised its head among the religions of the world. And the rise of the Sassanids gave it another spell of power. The founder of the new empire placed the Mobads at the head of the state, last sad representatives of a dying faith. Around them clustered the hopes of a renovated religious existence under the auspices of the Sassanid dynasty. How far the brilliant aspirations of Ardeshir Babekan, Artaxerxes Longimanus, the founder of the new empire, were realized is a matter of history. The political autonomy of Persia, its national life, was restored, but the social and religious life was lost beyond the power of rulers to revive. The teachings of yore lived perhaps in books, but in the hearts of the people they were as dead as old Gushtasp or Rustam. Under the Sassanids, the Zoroastrians attained the zenith of their power. For centuries they competed with Rome for the empire of Asia. Time after time they defeated her armies, sacked her cities, carried away her Caesars into captivity, and despoiled her subjects of their accumulated riches. But the fire of Zoroastrianism as a moral factor was extinct. It burnt upon the high altars of the temples, but it had died out from the heart of the nation. The worship of the true God has given place to a Chaldeo-Magian cult, and the fierce intolerance with which Ardeshir and his successors persecuted rival creeds failed to achieve its purpose. The Persian Empire, under the later Sassanids, only rivaled in the turmoil of its sects and the licentiousness of its sovereigns, in the degeneration of its aristocracy, and the overweening pride of its priesthood, the empire of the Byzantines. The kings were gods. They were absolute masters over the person and property of their subjects, who possessed no rights and were virtual serfs. The climax of depravity was reached when Mazdak, in the beginning of the 6th century of the Christian era, preached the communism with which modern Europe has now become familiar, and, quote, bade all men to be partners in riches and women, just as they are in fire, water, and grass. Private property was not to exist. Each man was to enjoy or endure the good and bad lots of this world. End quote. The lawfulness of marriages with sisters and other blood relations had already been recognized by Mago-Zoroastrianism. The proclamation of this extreme communism revolted the better minds even among the Persians. The successor of Zoroaster, as Mazdak styled himself, was put to death, but his doctrines had taken root, and from Persia they spread over the West. All these evils betokened a complete depravity of moral life and foreshadowed the speedy extinction of the nation in its own iniquities. This doom, though staved off for a time by the personal character of Kesra Anushirvan, became inevitable after his death. But a master had already appeared, destined to change the whole aspect of the world. 11 centuries had passed over the Jews since their return from the Babylonian captivity, and witnessed many changes in their fortunes. The series of disasters which one after another had befallen the doomed nation of Moses had culminated in the wars of Titus and Hadrian. Pagan Rome had destroyed their temple, and stamped out in fire and blood their existence as a nation. Christian Constantinople persecuted them with an equally relentless fury, but the misfortunes of the past had no lessons for them in the future. Their own sufferings at the hands of ruthless persecutors had failed to teach them the value of humanity and peace. The atrocious cruelties which they committed in the cities of Egypt, of Cyprus, and Cyrene, where they dwelt in treacherous harmony with the unsuspecting natives, take away all sense of pity for their future fate. The house of Israel was a total wreck. Its members were fugitives on the face of the earth, seeking shelter far and wide, but carrying everywhere their indomitable pride, their rebellious hardness of heart, denounced and reprehended by an endless succession of prophets. The Jews, in their safe retreats in foreign lands, reenacted the scenes of past times. The nation lived in hope, but the hope was mixed with rigid, uncompromising bigotry on one hand, and a voluptuous Epicureanism on the other. Jesus had come and gone, without producing any visible effect upon them. The child of his age, he was imbued with the messianic ideas floating in the atmosphere in which he lived and moved. The book of Daniel, written during one of the greatest travails of the nation, with its hopes and aspirations, could not but make a deep impression on the mind of the teacher mourning over the sight of his stricken people. The fierce intolerance of the zealots seated in their mountain homes, the lifeless ceremonialism of the Sadducees, the half-hearted liberalism of the Pharisees, the dreamy hopefulness of the Essenes, with one hand extended towards Alexandria and the other towards Buddhistic India, the preachings and denunciations of the wild dervish, whose life became a sacrifice to the depravity of the Herodian court, all appealed to the heart of Jesus. But the eagle's talons were clutched on the heart of Judea, and its legions crushed out all hope of a violent change. The quietism of Jesus and his earnest anticipation of a kingdom of heaven, to be ushered in by the direct instrumentality of God, were the outcome of his age. Among a nation of furious and relentless bigots, he had come as the messenger of universal brotherhood and love. In the midst of a proud and exclusive race, he trod the path of humility and meekness. Kind and gentle to his immediate followers, devoted to the cause of all, he left behind him the impress of an elevated, self-denying spirit. Among the powerful, the rich, and the ruling classes, he had roused only feelings of hatred, fear, and opposition. Among the poor, the despised, the ignorant, and the oppressed, the deep compassion of the great teacher had awakened sentiments of gratitude and love. One bright sunny morning he had entered the stronghold of Jewish fanaticism, full of hope in his ministry as the promised Messiah. Before a fortnight had run out, he was sacrificed to the vested interests of his day. Amidst the legends which surround his life, so much at least is clear. Born among the poor, his preachings were addressed to the poor. Deeply versed in the rabbinical lore, his short ministry was devoted almost exclusively to the humble denizens of the countryside, the poverty-stricken peasantry, and the fishermen of Galilee. His disciples were poor, ignorant folk. In spite of their credulous natures and the vivid, not to say weird, effect exercised on their imaginations by the untimely disappearance of the Master, they never regarded him as anything more than a man. It was not until Paul adopted the creed of him whose execution he had witnessed that the idea of an incarnate God or angel was introduced into Christianity. In spite of the promise attached to the, quote, effusion of the Holy Ghost, it was found necessary, says the historian of ecclesiasticism, that there should be some one defender of the gospel, who, versed in the learned arts, might be able to combat the Jewish doctors and the pagan philosophers with their own arms. For this purpose Jesus himself, by an extraordinary voice from heaven, had called to his service a 13th apostle, whose name was Saul, afterwards Paul, and whose acquaintance both with Jewish and Grecian learning was very considerable." The Mago-Zoroastrian believed in an angel deliverer, in the Surush, who was to appear from the east, the Buddhist in an incarnate God born of a virgin. The Alexandrian mystic inculcated the doctrine of the Logos and the Demiurge. The esoteric conceptions regarding the birth, death, and resurrection of Osiris, the idea of the Isis Ceres, the Virgin Mother, quote, holding in her arms the newborn sun god Horus, were in vogue both in Egypt and Syria. And Paul the Pharisee and the scholar was deeply imbued with these half-mystical, half-philosophical notions of his time. A visionary and enthusiast by nature, not free from physical ailments as Strauss suggests, he, who had never come in actual contact with the Master, was easily inclined to attach to him the attributes of a divinity, of an angel incarnate. He infused into the simple teachings of Jesus the most mysterious principles of Neo-Pythagoreanism, with its doctrine of intelligences and its notion of the triad borrowed from the Far East. The jealousy between the home and the foreign, the Judaical and the anti-Judaical party, was shown in the curious, though well-known antipathy of the two apostles, Peter and Paul. The Ebionites most probably represented the beliefs of the original companions of the Prophet of Nazareth. He had conversed with them familiarly and, quote, in all the actions of rational and animal life, had appeared to them as of the same nature as themselves. They had marked him grow from infancy to youth, and from youth to manhood. They had seen him increase in stature and wisdom. Their belief was tempered by their knowledge of him as a man. The deprivation of ideas from this original faith, through various intermediate phases like those of the Dacites, the Marcionites, the Patripassians, and various others down to the decisions of the Council of Nice in 328, forms a continuous chain. Footnote: the Dacites believed Jesus to be a pure God. The Marcionites regarded him as a being, quote, most like unto God, even his Son Jesus Christ, clothed with a certain shadowy resemblance of a body, that he might thus be visible to mortal eyes. The Patripassians believed that the Father suffered with the Son on the cross. End of footnote. The prevalent belief in aeons and emanations predisposed all classes of people, especially those who had never beheld the Prophet, observed his humanity, or noted his everyday life, to accept his divinity without any question. At the time Jesus began his preaching, the Empire of Rome stretched over more than half Europe and included almost the whole of northern Africa and a large part of Western Asia. This vast area, by an accident, became in the coming centuries the seed ground of Christianity and the battlefield of contending sects. Exactly a century before the Phrygian Cybele was brought to Rome, Ptolemy Soter, the most fortunate and probably the most far-sighted of Alexander's generals, had become master of Egypt. Footnote: the worship of Cybele has a very close analogy to the cult of the famous Hindu goddess Durga or Kali. End of footnote. With the object of fusing the Egyptians and Greeks into a homogeneous nation by the unifying bond of a common religion, he conceived the design of establishing a worship in the practice of which the two peoples would join hands. The same idea occurred to Akbar some 2,000 years later. But where the great Akbar failed, Ptolemy succeeded, for all the conditions were in his favor. The Greeks worshipped Zeus, Demeter, and Apollo or Dionysus, the Egyptians Osiris, Isis, and Horus. The Trinitarian belief was common to both. The Egyptian faith revolved round the passion and resurrection of Horus, the sun, the Greek in the passion and resurrection of Dionysus. The Greek had his Eleusinian mysteries, with all the mystic rites of initiation and communion. The Egyptian Hierophant, the mysteries of Isis, with similar rites and similar significance. To neither it mattered under what names the gods were worshipped or the rituals were conducted. So long as the main idea was maintained, they were indifferent to mere names. Thus was born the great cult of the Serapeum. Serapis took the place of Zeus among the Greeks, of Osiris among the Egyptians. Isis, who became quote-unquote the Mater Dolorosa of the votaries of the Alexandrian cult, displaced Demeter, and Horus Hippocrates absorbed the adoration hitherto rendered to Dionysus. This deity does not seem, however, to have lost his hold among the inhabitants of the seaboard of Asia Minor, and the prevailing belief that a god had lived among mankind, had suffered and died and risen again, made easy in later centuries the spread of Christianity. The worship of Isis, whose glory had overshadowed the personality of her consort, was brought to Rome, it is said some 80 years before the birth of Jesus. It seized at once the fancy both of the populace and of the cultivated classes. Its gorgeous ritual, its tonsured, clean-shaven priests, the young acolytes in white carrying lighted tapers, the solemn processions in which nothing was wanting to stimulate the emotions, the passionate grief at the suffering and death of Osiris Horus, the frenzied joy at his resurrection, the mysteries with all their mystical meanings, the initiation, above all the promise of immortality, appealed vividly to a world whose old gods were mute, and which yearned for a closer touch with the eternal problem of the universe. It is not surprising that Isis took a strong hold on the heart of the Roman people. Although the worship of Isis, quote, the bestower on the wretched the sweet affection of a mother, end quote, never lost its power on their emotions, the more virile cult of Mithra, the beautiful sun god, with all its mystic rites, its doctrine of atonement, its insistence on the direct touch of its god with humanity, was held in special favor among the Roman soldiers, and wherever the legionaries were quartered, they appear to have left the memorials of their worship. To form a just estimate of the superlative and exclusive claim advanced by Christianity to enroll under her banner and to dominate the conscience of all mankind, it is necessary to bear in mind the causes that helped in the diffusion of the Galilean faith before the accession of Constantine to the throne. The promise of the second advent of Jesus, with the immediate ushering in of the quote-unquote kingdom of God, when the poor would be exalted and Lazarus would take the place of Dives in the enjoyment of heavenly gifts, created among the humble folk a wild excitement. The fervent anticipations of the immediate disciples and followers of Jesus naturally communicated themselves to the neighboring peoples, and as the missionaries of the faith multiplied, they carried this vivid belief far and wide. The religion that held forth the promise of an early adjustment of inequalities and redress of wrongs and injustice received a ready acceptance among the masses. So strong a hold did the belief in the establishment of the kingdom of God with the second advent acquire among the populace that, although the fulfillment of the promise, which was assured to take place within the lifetime of the early disciples, receded as decades went by into dim futurity, the anticipations and hopes to which it gave birth did not lose their force until the final collapse of the Crusades. After 1,000 years, first of travail and later of success, the warriors of Christianity went forth to destroy the professors of another faith in the full belief that the second coming of their Lord was nigh. Besides this, there were other causes equally potent which helped the diffusion of Christianity in the shape it assumed after the death, or, according to Ebionite and Muslim belief, the disappearance of the Master. As already observed, among all the peoples of Asia Minor, Syria, and the Mediterranean littoral, excepting the Jews, the idea of a God who had died and risen again, and of a divine Trinity was universal. It was an essential part of the Serapian cult, and with the spread of Isis worship, every part of the Roman world was permeated by the Trinitarian conception. There was no difficulty arising from sentiment or religious predilection to the acceptance of the principal doctrines of post-Jesus Christianity. The philosophers at the same time, albeit unconsciously and without the intention of helping Christianity, even without any knowledge of its tenets, furthered its cause. Their speculations with regard to the nature of God and of a life after death undermined the faith of many thinking pagans in the mysteries of Isis and Mithra, and in the rites and practices of the old cults. And yet the hold of the Alexandrian divinities and of the sun god on the hearts of the cultivated classes, who looked askance at the revolutionary doctrines of the new cult, was so strong that for nearly 3 centuries the spread of Christianity was confined to the ignorant and uneducated. Not until the Christian Church had incorporated with its theology and ecclesiastical system many dogmas borrowed from its great and fascinating rivals, and almost all their rites and ceremonialism, and practices and institutions, did it make any headway among people of culture. And when these, under the stress of religious persecution or imperial pressure, began entering the fold, they brought with them all the elements that have gone to mold modern Christianity with its multitudinous sects. Relentless persecution lasting for centuries secured, however, in the early period of its growth, a certain uniformity of faith and doctrines. Among the masses, Isis worship was transformed into Mariolatry, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, became, instead of the Egyptian goddess, quote, the haven of peace and the altar of pity, end quote. Thenceforth she was worshipped, as she still is among the Latin races, as the Madre de Dios. Asceticism was a favored institution among the votaries of the Alexandrian divinities. It was practiced by the Pythagoreans and Orphics, who had derived much of their inspiration from the hierophants of the Gangetic Delta, among whom it was a common practice. The Christian Church adopted and sanctified this institution for both sexes. From the simple immersion used by John the Baptist, baptism under the influence of the cult of Isis grew into a mystical and cumbrous rite. Communion took the place of initiation, and even the dogma connected with the mysteries of Isis regarding the change of wine into the blood of the mourned god was absorbed into the Christian system. In the tonsured, clean-shaven, pale-clad priests, the white-robed acolytes, in the gorgeous rituals, in the form of the sacraments in the periods of the fasts and festivals of the Christian Church, looking back through the vista of ages, one is forcibly reminded of the older cults, and the religions which Christianity displaced rise before us in all their pomp and pageantry. We seem to hear once more in the litanies of the Church the beautiful, touching hymns sung to the Alexandrian goddess, the Mater Dolorosa of the Western pagan world, by 1,000 white-robed boys and girls, and it requires but little effort of fancy to carry back the imagination from St. Peter's or St. Paul's to the Serapeum. The religion of Jesus, as taught by his chief disciples, had, besides these borrowed and adventitious recommendations, distinct and independent claims to draw to itself the homage of those who, in the welter of spiritual conceptions and religious beliefs, were groping in semi-darkness for a resting place where high and low, ignorant and educated, should stand on the same plane. In its higher phases, it appealed to the nobler instincts of mankind, if not more forcibly than the Isaic or Mithraic creeds, certainly with greater assurance. Its promise of life after death was less veiled in mysteries. Its doctrines were more positive and concrete than the abstract speculations of the philosophers. It brought solace and comfort to the downtrodden and held forth a promise, not yet fulfilled, of equality and brotherhood among mankind, with an assured trust in future salvation to rich and poor alike among those who accepted its doctrines. Whilst the dogmaticism of its preachers, often assisted by secular force, silenced questioning minds, it satisfied the yearnings of those who, turning from the mysticism of the older cults, or fleeing from the hidden indecencies associated with nature worship, hungered for an assurance that the existence on earth was but part of a larger life. The whole of the Western pagan world was, in short, in an expectant mood, waiting for a positive and direct revelation, and all the teachings of the past had attuned its mind to the reception of a call. The Galilean faith seized the opportunity, and after appropriating and absorbing the ritual and doctrinal legacies left by its quote-unquote forerunners and rivals, gradually monopolized the homage of the peoples who had been subjected by Rome. Whether this adaptation of the simple teachings of Jesus to make them more readily acceptable was a development or the reverse must remain for the present unanswered. But the charge that the Muslims make against his followers that they corrupted his faith can hardly be said to be altogether unwarranted. End of section 3. Section 4 of The Spirit of Islam by Syed Ameer Ali. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction continued. The early cessation of the ministry of Jesus and the absence of any organic teaching, whilst it allowed a freer scope to imagination, perhaps a freer latitude of faith and practice, as shown in the lives of even the early Christians, furnished an open ground for contending factions to dispute not only about doctrines and discipline, but also as to the nature of their teacher. The expulsion of the Jews and the Christians from Jerusalem, which abounded in so many traditions relating to Jesus as a man, the intermixture of his followers with the non-Judaic people who surrounded them on all sides, and among whom the Neo-Pythagorean or Platonic ideas as to the government of the universe were more or less prevalent, the very vagueness which surrounded the figure of Jesus in the conception of his followers soon gave birth to an infinite variety of doctrines and sects. And age after age, everything human, everything not purely ideal, was smoothed away from the adored image of an incarnate God. The essentially pathetic history of Jesus was converted into a fairy tale, and his life so surrounded with myths that it is now impossible for us to know what he really was and did. The fantastic shapes assumed by Christianity in the centuries which preceded the advent of Muhammad are alike interesting and instructive. The Gnostic doctrines, which were wholly in conflict with the notions of the Judaic Christians, are supposed to have been promulgated towards the end of the 1st century, almost simultaneously with the capture and destruction of Jerusalem by Hadrian. Cerinthus, the most prominent of the Gnostic teachers of this century, inculcated among his followers the dual worship of the Father and the Son, whom he supposed to be totally distinct from the man Jesus, quote, the creator of the world, end quote. The narrowness of Pauline Christianity and its futile endeavors to reconcile its doctrines with the philosophy of the Alexandrian schools gave birth about the same time to the Neoplatonic eclecticism of Ammonius Saccas, adopted afterwards by Origen and other leading Christians. This versatile writer, whose impress is visible in the writings of almost all the prominent thinkers of Christendom in the earlier centuries, endeavored to bring about a general concordance among all the existing creeds and sects. In some respects, Ammonius was the prototype of Mani, or Manes, and was undoubtedly above the level of his contemporaries. He succeeded in forming a school, but his teachings never regulated the morals or influenced the faith of a community. The 2nd century of the Christian era was ushered in strife and disorder. Divisions and heresies were rife throughout the Christian Church. Gnosticism was in great force, and left its character indelibly impressed on Christianity. Some of the sects which came into prominence in this century deserve a passing notice, as they show not only the evils which flowed from the teachings of the Church, but also the influence exercised upon Christianity by Zoroastrianism, Neo-Pythagoreanism, and the ancient Sabaeism of the Chaldeans. The Marcionites, who were perhaps the most important of the early Gnostics, believed in the existence of two principles, the one perfectly good and the other perfectly evil. Between these there existed the demiurge, an intermediate kind of deity, neither perfectly good nor perfectly evil, but of a mixed nature, who administered rewards and inflicted punishments. The demiurge was, according to the Marcionite doctrines, the creator of this inferior world, and engaged in perpetual conflict with the principle of evil, mark the impress of Zoroastrian ideas. The supreme principle, in order to terminate this warfare and to deliver from their bondage the human souls, whose origin is celestial and divine, sent to the Jews, quote, a being most like unto himself, even his Son Jesus Christ, end quote, clothed with a certain shadowy resemblance of a body, that thus he might be visible to mortal eyes. The commission to this celestial messenger was to destroy the empire, both of the evil principle and of the author of this world, and to bring back wandering souls to God. Quote, "On this account he was attacked with inexpressible violence and fury by the principle of evil," and by the demiurge, but without effect, since, having a body only in appearance, he was thereby rendered incapable of suffering. The Valentinians, whose influence was more lasting, taught that, quote, "the supreme God permitted Jesus, his Son, to descend from the upper regions to purge mankind of all the evils unto which they had fallen, clothed not with a real but with a celestial and aerial body." The Valentinians believed Jesus to be an emanation from the divine essence come upon earth to destroy the dominion of the Prince of Darkness. The Ophites, who flourished in Egypt, entertained the same notions as the other Egyptian Gnostics concerning the eons, the eternity of matter, the creation of the world in opposition to the will of God, the tyranny of the demiurge, and, quote, "the divine Christ united to the man Jesus in order to destroy the empire of this usurper." They also maintained that the serpent by which Adam and Eve were deceived was either Christ himself or Sophia disguised as a serpent. Whilst the Gnostic creeds were springing into existence under the influence of Chaldean philosophy, the Greeks on their side endeavored to bring about a certain harmony between the Pauline doctrine concerning, quote, "the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, and the two natures united in Christ," and their own philosophical views as to the government of the world. Praxeas was the first of these sophistical preachers of Christianity, and he set the ball rolling by denying any real distinction between the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and maintained that the Father was so intimately united with the man Christ, his Son, that he suffered with him the anguish of an afflicted life and the torments of an ignominious death. These sects, says Mosheim, were the offspring of philosophy. A worse evil was to befall the Christian Church in the person of Montanus, a native of Phrygia." This man, who disdained all knowledge and learning, proclaimed himself the Paraclete promised by Jesus. He soon succeeded in attaching to himself a large body of followers, the most famous of whom were Priscilla and Maximilla, the prophetesses, quote, "ladies more remarkable for their opulence than for their virtue." They turned northern Asia into a slaughterhouse, and by their insensate fury inflicted terrible sufferings on the human race. Whilst the Marcionites, Valentinians, Montanists, and the other Gnostic sects were endeavoring to spread their doctrines throughout the Empire of Rome, there arose in Persia a man whose individuality has impressed itself in ineffaceable characters on the philosophy of the two continents. Mani was, to all accounts, the most perfect embodiment of the culture of his age. He was an astronomer, a physicist, a musician, and an artist of eminence. The stories relating to his art gallery have passed into a proverb. Thoroughly acquainted with the Jewish Kabbalah and the teachings of the Gnostic masters, imbued with the ancient philosophy and mysticism of the East, a Magi by birth and Christian by education, he rose in revolt against the jarring discord which surrounded him on all sides, and set himself to the task of creating, from the chaos of beliefs, an eclectic faith which would satisfy all demands, the aspirations of all hearts. The audacity with which Mani applied himself to undermine the current faiths by an outward profession, joined to a subtle criticism which destroyed all foundations of belief in the neophyte, a process afterwards imitated by his congeners, the Ismailias, and his assertion, like the Batanis, of an esoteric insight into all religious doctrines, armed against him every creed and sect, and naturally, wherever he or his disciples appeared, they were persecuted with unparalleled ferocity. The doctrine of money was a fantastic mixture of the tenets of Christianity with the ancient philosophy of the Persians and the Chaldeans. According to him, matter and mind are engaged in perpetual strife with each other. In the course of this conflict, human beings were created by the principle of matter, endowed with two natures, one divine, the other material, the former being a part of the light or spirit which had been filched from heaven. In order to release the struggling divine soul from the prison in which it was confined, the supreme God sent from the solar regions an entity created from his own substance, which was called Christ. Christ, accordingly, appeared among the Jews clothed with the shadowy form of a human body, and during his ministry taught mortals how to disengage the rational soul from the corrupt body, to conquer the violence of malignant matter. The Prince of Darkness having incited the Jews to put him to death, he was apparently, but not in reality, crucified. On the contrary, having fulfilled his mission, he returned to his throne in the sun. The Manichaean Christ thus could neither eat, drink, suffer, nor die. He was not even an incarnate God, but an illusory phantasm, quote, the all-pervading light element imprisoned in nature, striving to escape matter without assuming its forms. However blasphemous and irrational these doctrines may seem, they appear hardly more so to Muslims than the doctrine of transubstantiation, the changing of the Eucharistic elements into the actual flesh and blood of the deity. Manes divided his disciples into two classes, one the quote-unquote elect, and the other the quote-unquote hearers. The elect were compelled to submit to rigorous abstinence from all animal food and intoxicating drink, to abjure wedlock and all gratification of the senses. The discipline appointed for the hearers was of a milder kind. They were allowed to possess houses, lands, and wealth, to feed upon flesh, to enter into the bonds of conjugal relationship. But this liberty was granted them with many limitations, and under the strictest conditions of moderation and temperance. Manes or Mani was put to death by Bahram Ghor, but his doctrines passed into Christianity and were visible in all the struggles which rent the Church in later times. About the middle of the 3rd century arose the sect of the Sabellians, which marked a new departure in the religion of Jesus. They regarded Jesus as only a man, and believed that a certain energy proceeding from the Supreme Father had united itself with the man Jesus, thus constituting him the Son of God. This peculiar doctrine, which Gibbon regards as an approach to Unitarianism, was the cause of serious disorders in the Christian Church, and led to the promulgation in the early part of the 4th century by Origen of the doctrine of three distinct personalities in the Godhead. Tritheism was only a modification of the ancient paganism suited to the character of the people who had adopted the creed of Jesus. Polytheism was ingrained in their nature, and tritheism was a compromise between the teachings of Jesus and the ancient worship of a number of personalities. In the course of time, tritheism merged into the doctrine of the Trinity, but not before it had given birth to the most philosophic sect of Christianity. The rise of Arianism is due principally to the revolt of the human intellect from the irrational teachings of the Church. In Alexandria, which was at that time the most fanatical of Christian cities, Arius had the boldness to preach, in opposition to his own bishop, that Christ was not of the same essence with God. Arianism soon spread itself in Egypt and northern Africa, and in spite of violent and frequent persecution, kept its hold on these parts as well as Spain until his followers were taken into the fold of Islam. Footnote: in the latter part of the 16th century of the Christian era, Satsianus of Siena in Italy revived and amplified the doctrine of Arius. The Unitarians of the present day are the direct spiritual descendants of the Socinians, who denied the divinity of Jesus. They also repudiated the doctrine of original sin and atonement. To them, God alone was the object of adoration. End of footnote. The troubles generated by the schism of Arius induced Constantine in A.C. 325 to assemble the Council of Nice in Bithynia. In this general council, after many violent efforts on both sides, the doctrine of Arius was condemned, and, quote, Christ was declared consubstantial with the Father, end quote. Whatever may have been the condition of the Christian Church before, henceforth its history presents a constant and deplorable record of trouble and violence, of internecine strife and wrangling, of fearful and cruel persecutions, of bitter hatred, and a perpetual endeavor to crush out reason and justice from the minds of men. The vices of the regular clergy assumed monstrous proportions, and the luxury, arrogance, and voluptuousness of the sacerdotal order became the subject of complaint on all sides. The asceticism of the early times had given place to monasticism, and the licentiousness of the monks became a byword. They were the free lance of the Church, always foremost in fomenting tumults and seditions, and the streets of Constantinople, Alexandria, and Rome frequently ran with blood in consequence of their unruliness and turbulence. The disputes of Nestorius with Cyril, the murderer of Hypatia, forms a prominent chapter in the history of Christianity. The Second Council of Ephesus was convoked partly with the object of conciliating the various parties which had sprung up in the Church. But, quote, the despotism of the Alexandrian Patriarch, says Gibbon, again oppressed the freedom of debate. The heresy of the two natures was formally condemned. May those who divide Christ be divided with the sword. May they be hewn in pieces. May they be burned alive, were the charitable wishes of a Christian synod. End quote. At the Council of Chalcedon, which was convened at the instance of the Bishop of Rome, the doctrine of the incarnation of Christ in one person but in two natures was definitely settled. The Monophysites and Nestorians, revolting from the doctrine of incarnation, endeavored to make a stand against the decree of Chalcedon, but they succumbed under the furious onslaught of the Orthodox, who had succeeded in solving the mystery of their teacher's nature. Jerusalem was occupied by an army of monks. In the name of one incarnate nature, they pillaged, they murdered. The sepulchre of Christ was defiled with blood. The Alexandrian Christians who had murdered a woman did not hesitate to massacre their patriarch in the baptistry, committing his mangled corpse to the flames and his ashes to the wind. About the middle of the 6th century, the drooping fortunes of the Monophysites revived under the guidance of one of their leaders, Jacob, Bishop of Edessa. Under him and his successor, they acquired overwhelming predominance in the Eastern Empire, and by their unrelenting persecution of the Nestorians and their bitter quarrels with the Orthodox or the Chalcedonians, plunged the Christian Church into internecine warfare and bloodshed. To a non-Christian, the doctrines of the Monophysites, who taught that, quote, the divine and human nature of Christ were so founded as to form only one nature, yet without any change, confusion, or mixture of the two natures, seem to be in no way different from those laid down by the Council of Chalcedon. Yet this distinction without a difference was the cause of untold misery to a large number of the human race. At last, in 630 A.C., Heraclius tried to allay the disorders by starting a new sect, that of the Monothelites, whose doctrines were no less monstrous and fantastical. The Monothelites maintained that, quote, Christ was both perfect God and perfect man, and that in him were two distinct natures, so united as to cause no mixture or confusion, but to form by their union only one person. Instead, however, of bringing peace into the bosom of the Church of Jesus, the rise of this sect intensified the evil, and Western Asia, Northern Africa, and various parts of Europe continued to be the scene of massacres and murders and every kind of outrage in the name of Christ. Such was the religious condition of Christendom during the centuries which preceded the advent of Islam. With the apparent conversion of Constantine, Christianity became the dominant power in the Roman Empire. The fate of paganism was sealed. Its downfall, though staved off for a time by the greatest and most sincere of the Roman emperors, had become inevitable. After the extinction of paganism, says Gibbon, the Christians, in peace and piety, might have enjoyed their solitary triumph. But the principle of discord was alive in their bosom, and they were more solicitous to explore the nature than to practice the laws of their founder. Footnote: the Emperor Julian, the so-called apostate, is reported to have said, "No wild beasts are so hostile to man as Christian sects in general are to one another." End of footnote. The whole of Christian Europe was immersed in absolute darkness, and the Church of Jesus was rent with schisms and heresies. The religious conception of the masses had not advanced beyond the pagan stage. The souls of the dead were worshipped in numbers, and the images of those who were honored in life were objects of adoration. Relic and saint worship had become universal. Christianity had reverted to heathenism. The social and political condition of the nations subject to the sway of Christianity was equally deplorable. Liberty of thought and freedom of judgment were crushed out from among mankind, and the reign of Christ was celebrated by the sacrifice of heretics who ventured to differ from any idea which predominated for the time. In the streets of Alexandria, before the eyes of the civilized world, the noblest woman of antiquity was slaughtered with nameless horrors by a Christian who bears the title of saint in the annals of Christendom, and who in modern times has found an apologist. The eloquent pages of Draper furnish a vivid account of the atrocious crime which will always remain one of the greatest blots on Christianity. A beautiful, wise, and virtuous woman, whose lecture room was full to overflowing with the wealth and fashion of Alexandria, was attacked as she was coming out of her academy by a mob of the zealous professors of Christianity. Amidst the fearful yelling of those defenders of the faith, she was dragged from her chariot, and in the public street stripped naked. Paralyzed with fear, she was haled into an adjoining church, and there killed by the club of a quote-unquote saint. The poor naked corpse was outraged and then dismembered. But the diabolical crime was not completed until they had scraped the flesh from the bones with oyster shells and cast the remnants into the fire. Christendom honored with canonization the fiend who instigated this terrible and revolting atrocity, and the blood of martyred Hypatia was avenged only by the sword of Amru. Footnote: Amru ibn al-Asi, or As, of Arabian history. End of footnote. The condition of Constantinople under Justinian, the Christian and the glorified legislator, is the best index to the demoralized and degraded state of society all over Christendom. Public or private virtue had no recognition in the social conceptions. A harlot sat on the throne of the Caesars and shared with the emperor the honors of the state. Theodora had publicly plied her trade in the city of Constantine, and her name was a byword among its dissolute inhabitants. And now she was adored as a queen in the same city by grave magistrates, orthodox bishops, victorious generals, and captive monarchs. The empire was disgraced by her cruelties, which recognized no religious or moral restraint. Seditions, outbreaks, and sanguinary tumults, in which the priesthood always took the most prominent part, were the order of the day. On these occasions every law, human or divine, was trampled underfoot. Churches and altars were polluted by atrocious murders. No place was safe or sacred from depredations. The bonds of society were rent asunder, and revolting outrages were perpetrated in broad daylight. Nothing, however, can equal the horrors which were inflicted upon this unholy city during the Nika riots of the 5th year of Justinian's reign. The horrible anarchy of the circus, with its incessant bloodshed and sensuality, stimulated to its worst excesses by the support and encouragement which the imperial champions of orthodoxy extended to the most barbarous of the factions, was unparalleled in any heathen land. As compared with Constantinople at this period, Persia was a country of order and law. Humanity revolts from the accounts of the crimes which sully the annals of Christian Constantinople. Whilst the Prophet of Islam was yet an infant, one of the most virtuous emperors who ever ascended the throne of Byzantium was massacred, with his children and wife, with fearful tortures at the instance of a Christian monarch. The emperor was dragged from his sanctuary, and his 5 sons were successively murdered before his eyes. And this tragic scene closed with the execution of the emperor himself. The empress and her daughters were subjected to nameless cruelties, and then beheaded on the very ground which had been stained with the blood of the poor Emperor Maurice. The ruthless treatment meted out to the friends, companions, and partisans of the imperial victim serves as an index to the morality of the Byzantine Christians. Their eyes were pierced, their tongues were torn from the root, their hands and feet were amputated. Some expired under the lash, others in the flames, others again were transfixed with arrows. A simple, speedy death, says Gibbon, was a mercy which they could rarely obtain. The Byzantine Empire, slowly bleeding unto death, torn by political and religious factions, distracted with theological wranglings, and, crazed by an insane desire to enforce uniformity of religious belief, offered a wretched spectacle of assassinations, dissoluteness, and brutality. Footnote: Milman thus describes the Christianity of those days. The Bishop of Constantinople was the passive victim, the humble slave, or the factious adversary of the Byzantine emperor, rarely exercised a lofty moral control upon his despotism. The lower clergy, whatever their more secret, beneficent, or sanctifying workings on society, had sufficient power, wealth, and rank to tempt ambition or to degrade to intrigue, not enough to command the public mind for any great salutary purpose, to repress the inveterate immorality of an effete age, to reconcile jarring interests, to mold together hostile races. In general, they ruled, when they did rule, by the superstitious fears rather than by the reverence and attachment of a grateful people. They sank downward into the common ignorance, and yielded to the worst barbarism, a worn-out civilization. Monasticism withdrew a great number of those who might have been energetic and useful citizens into barren seclusion and religious indolence. But except when the monks formed themselves, as they frequently did, into fierce political or polemic factions, they had little effect on the conditions of society. They stood aloof from the world, the anchorites in their desert wildernesses, the monks in their jealousy-barred convents, and secure, as they supposed, of their own salvation, left the rest of mankind to inevitable perdition. End of footnote. The countries included in Asiatic Turkey westward of the Euphrates, devastated alternately by the Parthians and the Romans, and then by the Persians and the Byzantines, presented a picture of utter hopelessness. The moral misery of the people was surpassed by their material ruin. The followers of Jesus, instead of alleviating, intensified the evil. Mago-Zoroastrianism combating with a degraded Christianity in Mesopotamia, the Nestorians engaged in deadly conflict with the Orthodox party, the earlier contests of Montanus and the prophetesses had converted Western Asia into a wilderness of despair and desolation. The whirlwinds of conquest which had passed over Africa, the massacres, the murders, the lawlessness of the professors and teachers of the Christian religion had destroyed every spark of moral life in Egypt and in the African provinces of the decaying empire. In Europe, the condition of the people was, if possible, still more miserable. In the open day, in the presence of the ministers of religion and the people, Narses, the benefactor of his country, was burnt alive in the marketplace of Constantinople. In the streets of Rome, under the eyes of the exarch, the partisans of rival bishops waged war and deluged churches with the blood of Christians. Spain exhibited a heart-rending scene of anarchy and ruin. The rich, the privileged few, who held the principal magistracies of the province under the emperors, or who were dignified with the title of magistrates, were exempt from all burdens. They lived in extreme luxury in beautiful villas, surrounded by slaves of both sexes, spending their time in the baths, which were so many haunts of immorality, or at the gaming table when not engaged in eating and drinking. The sight of this luxury and opulence offered a terrible contrast to the miseries of the masses. The middle class, the free population of the cities and the villages, were ground to the earth by the tyranny of the Romans. Agrarian slavery had disappeared. Its place was taken by the colonists, occupying an intermediate position between freedom and slavery. They were in some respects happier than the slaves. They could contract valid marriages. They obtained a limited share of the produce of the lands they cultivated, and their patrons could not take their goods and chattels from them. But in all other respects they were the slaves of the soil. Their personal services were at the disposal of the state. They were liable to corporal chastisement like the domestic slaves. Footnote: 300 lashes was the usual allowance for trivial faults. End of footnote. Slaves not of an individual, but of the soil, they remained attached to the lands they cultivated by an indissoluble and hereditary tie. The condition of the slaves, who formed the bulk of the population, was miserable beyond description. They were treated with pitiless cruelty, worse than cattle. The invasion of the barbarians brought with it a dire punishment upon the ill-fated land. In their wake followed desolation, terrible and absolute. They ravaged, they massacred, they reduced into slavery the women, children, and the clergy. A vast number of Jews were settled in the peninsula for centuries. The terrible persecutions which they suffered at the hands of the ecclesiastics in the reign of the Visigoth Sisebut in the year 616 A.C. lasted until Islam brought emancipation to the wretched victims of ignorance and fanaticism. It was Islam which rendered possible for Judaism to produce such men as Maimonides, or Ibn Jibral. End of section 4. Section 5 of The Spirit of Islam by Syed Ameer Ali. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction continued. Let us now turn to Arabia, that land of mystery and romance, which has hitherto lain enwrapped in silence and solitude, isolated from the great nations of the world, unaffected by their wars or their polity. The armies of the Khosrows and the Caesars had for centuries marched and remarched by her frontiers without disturbing her sleep of ages. And though the mutterings of the distant thunder, which so frequently rolled across the dominions of the Byzantine and the Persian, often reached her ears, they failed to rouse her from her slumber. Her turn, however, was come, and she found her voice in that of the noblest of her sons. The chain of mountains which, descending from Palestine towards the Isthmus of Suez, runs almost parallel to the Red Sea, down to the southern extremity of the Arabian Peninsula, is designated in the Arabic language Hijaz, or barrier, and gives its name to all the country it traverses until it reaches the province of Yemen. At times the mountains run close to the sea. At times they draw far away from the coast, leaving long stretches of lowland, barren, desolate, and inhospitable, with occasional green valleys and rich oases formed in the track of the periodical rain torrents. Beyond this range and eastward stretches the steppe of Najd, the quote-unquote highland of Arabia, a vast plateau with deserts, mountain gorges, and here and there green plantations refreshing to the eye. In Hijaz, the barrier land, lie the holy cities Mecca and Medina, the birthplace and cradle of Islam. This vast region is divided into 4 tolerably well-defined countries. First, to the north lies Arabia Petria, including the countries of the ancient Edomites and the Midianites. Then comes Hijaz proper, containing the famous city of Yathrib, known afterwards in history as the city of the Prophet, Medinatun Nabi, or Medina. South of Hijaz proper lies the province of Tihama, where are situated Mecca and the port of Jeddah, the landing place of the pilgrims of Islam. The fourth and the southernmost part is called Asir, bordering on Yemen. Yemen, properly so called, is the country forming the southwestern extremity of the Arabian Peninsula, bounded on the west by the Red Sea, on the south by the Indian Ocean, on the north by Hijaz, and on the east by Hadramaut. The name of Yemen is often applied to southern Arabia generally. It then includes, besides Yemen proper, Hadramaut and the district of Mahra to the east of Hadramaut. Beyond Mahra, at the southeast corner of the peninsula, is Amman, and to the north of this is El Bahrain, or El Aqsa, on the Persian Gulf. This latter country is also called Hijr, from the name of its principal province. Najd, the highland, is the large plateau which, commencing westward on the eastern side of the mountains of Hijaz, occupies the whole of central Arabia. That portion of Najd which borders on Yemen is called the Najd of Yemen, and the northern part simply Najd. These 2 divisions are separated by a mountainous province called Yemama, famous in the history of Islam. North of Najd stretches the Syrian desert, not really a part of Arabia, but where the Arab tribes now roam, free and wild, leading a nomadic life like their ancient Aramean predecessors. Northeast are the deserts of Iraq, Barriyatul Iraq, bordering the fertile territory of Chaldea on the right bank of the Euphrates, and separating it from the cultivated portions of Arabia. Eastward, Najd is separated from Al-Aqsa by one of those strips of desert called Nafut by the Arabs. Towards the south lies the vast desert of Dakhna. It separates Najd from Hazramaut and Mahra. This vast region, which embraces an area twice the size of France in the height of its power, was then as now inhabited by two different types of people, quote-unquote, the people of the town and the dwellers of the desert. The virtues and the defects of the Badawi, his devotion to his clan, his quixotic sense of honor, with his recklessness and thirst for revenge, and his disregard for human life, have been portrayed in vivid and sympathetic colors by eminent writers like Burton and Poole. But whatever the difference between the Bedouin and the citizen, the Arab is peculiarly the child of the desert. His passionate love of freedom and his spiritual exaltation are the outcome of the free air which he breathes and of the wide expanse which he treads, conscious of his own dignity and independence. In spite of the annual gatherings at Mecca and Ukaz, the tribes and nationalities which inhabited the soil of Arabia were far from homogeneous. Each was more or less distinct from the other in development and religion. This diversity was mainly due to the diversity of their origin. Various races had peopled the peninsula at various times. Many of them had passed away, but their misdeeds and their prowess